So hello everyone, my name is Mengying. It's very happy to be here to share with you a research I have been doing since 2021. So it's a research about how big data was integrated into local government's response to COVID-19. But I think before I started my presentation, so I wanted to explain a bit so in this research, I'm gonna share with you some findings from my fieldwork trips in a southern China city, where I interviewed government officials involved in pandemic control. I tried to understand how big data was collected, distributed, and processed in government's practices. But the purpose is not really to unpack, to open a black box of how government works, how government use those data to track people. That's not really my purpose. It's very much really, my purpose is really to understand the digital transformation of government, understand how the impact of urban digital infrastructure. I try to put my questions under the specific context of governance. So I will start it with a bit of the background and to explain the methodology, and I will share with you two initial findings from the research. So what's special about big data governance during COVID-19? I think obviously before COVID, it's very common for government worldwide to try to use big data in everyday governance. But what we saw is new during COVID is that new data types have been used at unprecedented scales and scopes. If you considered all sorts of locative data, geographic data that have been used to in tasks like contact tracing, in testing, etc. And what's more important is that we saw these kinds of new data types become integral to decision-making processes and immediately result in measures like quarantine measures or affect the governance the measures the government took in pandemic control. And why the case of China is interesting and important, I think first, we could see that during COVID, China took a very pervasive approach in terms of big data use. You have very controversial examples like the health code. And it's also interesting in a sense that nowadays, building a digital China has become a national strategy. And when people talking about, there are already a lot of discussions on China's big data governance during COVID. And the key focus has been big data and state control and state surveillance. So the assumption was that those big data strategies was a national initiative. It was considered as in this arguments, like the role of digital technology of big data was often considered as a tool for the government to reinforce control. But we could also learn from previous research, like the landscape of Chinese governance is very complex. On the one hand, the role, the governance processes involve different government agencies from different departments at different levels. So there can be very significant disparity between a national strategy and local implementation. And the second thing is that we learn from infrastructure studies and also critical data studies that it's dangerous to reduce the role of digital technology to tool, because we could realize that big data has its unique technical features, and it's always all those data governance practices, they're always intertwined with other aspects, with cultural, economic, and technological aspects. So in this research, I looked at how local government systems in China, how they integrate big mobility data into their governance practices. I will specifically examine how pandemic-related data was generated, aggregated, processed, and distributed. And that actually you will find in the findings that there's something related to our previous discussion that big data and digital technology is really difficult to control. So in terms of methodology, so those data, I mainly did in-depth interviews with government officials responsible for pandemic control. So most of them are from like public health department and also from like big data centers. And I did interviews with 12 officials during several fieldwork trips. So I interviewed of them, like each of them for twice or third times, like at different stages of the pandemic. So these are their government roles. So all the interviews were conducted at their office, where I could see that they are actually, this is a photo. You could see it's a spreadsheet. So the interviewee was processing the data, was dealing with the pandemic related data. So that really helps me to get an insider view of how the government processed those data. So I'd like to share with you two findings. So the first finding is related to how local governments try to integrate big mobility data in governance. I think what's quite, I'm going to use one example to explain. So during the pandemic, there was one specific task related to the use of mobile data to identify travelers coming from high-risk areas. So it means that every time when an area was identified as newly identified as a high-risk area, then other provinces will get data of people has traveled from or have arrived from those high-risk areas. So then the local governments need to take measures like to ensure they stay at home or take testings. So those data mainly come from mobile phone carriers like the China Mobile, and the data type is a list of phone numbers. So what I found was that those kind of data was actually distributed through a highly hierarchical process. So those data was provided by the Ministry of Industry and Information Technology in cooperation with the three major telecommunication companies in China. And the data would then be distributed from provincial level to city level and then down to the village level governments. And in this whole process, it will go through multiple filtering steps. And different from an understanding of a highly centralized and automated system of data collection and distribution, what I observed from the field work is rather highly hierarchical, but also a process that involves multiple steps of filtering, report back, and distribute again. And that also involves significant manual efforts at grassroots level. Let me give you an example. For instance, when a village member, where a community worker at the village received a spreadsheet of telephone numbers of people just arrived from high-risk areas, the data only includes, at the time, the data only includes a list of telephone numbers and the location and their original the departure areas. It doesn't include the name or the ID number or other like the current address of this person, no. So what the community worker needs to do was to make phone calls in these very traditional mechanisms to get the new updated information about this person. So here you could see a quote from a grid member at village. He said, they only give you the phone number and said where it came from, but you don't know what the person is. So all they knew was the phone number. So they had to use their own phone number to make phone calls to check with the person. So many of their own phone numbers were blacklisted. So you could see that on the one hand, we have this expectation or imagination of a huge amount of data processed automatically. But in reality, you could see it turned out to be a very limited data, but high volume and low accuracy. So that posed enormous challenge to the local governance practices. And then I'd like to share with you another finding. It's about the conflicts between spatial temporal characteristics of big data and the bureaucratic processes. So those mobility data, they're generated, they were generated by those cell phone towers. So in terms of spatiality, they were based on base station locations rather than administrative boundaries. And also in terms of temporality, these data are generated continuously, and it always involves very labor-intense processing. So that poses very significant spatial challenges and temporal challenges to the government. On the one hand, you have this kind of real-time data, and in the context of a pandemic, the authorities was supposed to act quickly so that it could help to stop the spread of the virus. But after this huge amount of data being distributed through different levels, it's actually very difficult to act upon those data. So I will, due to time limit, I will only give you one example. So this is an example of how the local governments try to balance between the conflicts of those data practices and the bureaucratic processes. I think many of you from mainland China heard about this term called 时空伴随者. It's called time-space companion. So there was a time in City M when a new case was identified at the city center. So because of the spatial attributes of this type of data, so it's only specific because the cell phone towers can only detect the data from a radius of 800 meters. So when this newly identified case happened in the city center, it basically means the whole city, all that are considered as potentially high risk people exposed to infections. So he said, according to this diameter, the entire city center was included. So when they look at the data, they got 180,000 people that they should actually took all the measures. But it's impossible to actually check with each person to see that they stay at home. So they communicated with the upper level government, decided to send each of them a text message. So he said, according to the requirements, all this data must be processed on the same day. But he asked, what's the use of giving me hundreds and thousands of data? It's better not to give it because I have to process all of them. So with these two findings, I think what I wanted to highlight is that on the one hand, you could see that digital infrastructure and big data are central to local government's response to COVID-19 because almost every kind of government tasks, what they need to do in their everyday job was shaped by digital technologies. So you could see an increasing use of big data in government operations, and it's reshaping governance structures and processes. But on the other hand, you could also see that it's very different from our previous perception of a highly centralized and automated governance. I think this research shows the fragmented nature of data governance in China, which is highly intertwined with the bureaucratic logic of government agencies. And in the future, we could foresee that with the build of digital infrastructures and with the integration of big data in governance, that would push the government to change its structure, change the way government works. So it's not just that digital technology provide another tool to reinforce control, to enhance the efficiency of governance. It really changes how government works in a digital era. So that's it. Thank you.